In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the West, fortunes are not just found in gold or land, but forged in the crucible of ambition and betrayal. It is a place where the silence of the desert can hide the loudest truths, and where the human heart can be as wild and untamable as the land itself. This is a story of a man who built an empire of steel and steam, only to find his own home built on foundations of sand. It is a tale of two women, one who fought with quiet strength, and another who wielded ambition like a loaded gun. The sun-bleached floorboards of the Sovereignty County Courthouse reflected a man torn in two. On one side of Julian Croft stood his lawyer, Gideon Sharp, a man whose face was carved from the same hard granite as the nearby mesas. On the other, Cassia Thorne offered a delicate hand on his arm, her touch a comforting pressure that did little to soothe the tremor in his soul. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds, held a triumphant gleam she barely concealed behind a mask of gentle concern. They were all waiting for one person, Ilara Vance, Julian's pregnant wife. But the tall, swinging doors of the courtroom remained stubbornly shut. Ilara was gone, vanished into the thin, dry air of the territory. As the anxious whispers of the townsfolk turned to hushed, worried calls, Cassia's subtle smile deepened. She believed she had won. She had carved out her place in this harsh land, securing the ultimate prize, the man who had tamed it. She had no idea that a single, unspoken truth, already set in motion, was about to detonate the world she had so meticulously built. The morning of the hearing had dawned with an unnatural quiet over the Croft Ranch, a sprawling domain of cattle and pastureland carved out of the desert by Julian's relentless will. Julian Croft, a man whose name was synonymous with the railroad, with steel tracks that sliced through ancient landscapes and brought civilization at a cutthroat pace, stood before a tall window in his master suite. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, his reflection showing a man who had conquered territories and bested rivals, yet couldn't command peace within his own four walls. The air, usually filled with the scent of the desert wildflowers Ilara cultivated, or the soft sound of her humming a folk tune, was sterile and silent. Ilara, his wife of 7 years, the woman whose quiet strength had been the bedrock upon which he'd built the most successful phase of his empire. And now, the woman who was, according to Gideon Sharp, trying to take him for half of everything he was worth. 6 months pregnant with his child, she had filed for divorce 2 months ago, citing grievances that felt like a public spectacle in their small, bustling town. He heard a soft footfall behind him. Cassia Thorne, dressed in a sharp navy riding dress that was both practical and alluring, glided into the room. She was the firebrand from back east he'd hired to manage his land acquisitions, a woman whose ambition and charisma had caught his eye during a grueling negotiation over a water rights dispute. What had started as late-night strategy sessions over maps and whiskey had spiraled into something else, something intoxicating and dangerous. "Ready to face the town, Julian?" she asked, her voice a low purr. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. Her perfume, a sharp, expensive scent from a city far away, was a stark contrast to Ilara's subtle, earthy fragrance of sage and lavender. Julian grunted, his eyes still fixed on the dusty corrals outside. "As I'll ever be. Gideon says it's an open and shut case. Her claims are baseless." "Of course they are," Cassia cooed, her fingers tracing the lapels of his tailored suit jacket. She had clawed her way from nothing, a past she never spoke of, but that was etched in the fierce determination of her gaze. She saw Ilara not as a rival, but as an obstacle, a gentle creature who didn't understand the savage nature of survival. She's desperate, a woman in her condition, about to lose the life she's known, They do foolish things. He didn't respond. The dismissive way she spoke of Alara felt like a burr under his saddle. He remembered the night Alara had found out about them. He had returned late from a trip, the foreign scent of Cassia's perfume clinging to his coat. Alara hadn't screamed or thrown things. She had simply looked at him, her large, honest eyes filled with a pain so profound it had momentarily sobered him from his intoxicating affair. She had placed a hand on her small, burgeoning belly and said, "This child will not be raised in a house of lies, Julian. Not this child." The next day, the papers were served. Sensing his disquiet, Cassia tightened her grip. "Don't think about her, my love. Think about us. After today, this is all over. She'll get a settlement, a generous one, and then she'll be out of our lives. We can finally be together, properly." The "we" sounded so certain, so solid, but a knot of unease tightened in Julian's stomach. He had allowed this to happen. He had been careless, arrogant, believing he could manage two separate worlds without them ever colliding. Now the collision was imminent, and the wreckage was his life. They arrived at the courthouse to find a small crowd gathered. The Sovereignty Sentinel's reporter was there, his pen scratching furiously in a small notebook. Julian Croft's divorce was the biggest news the town had seen in years. He was the local titan, and the story had all the elements of a dime store novel. A vast fortune, a beautiful and ambitious newcomer, and a scorned, pregnant wife. He pushed through the onlookers, Cassia's hand firmly in his, her face a perfect portrait of supportive concern for the ravenous public. Inside, they took their seats. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. 9 o'clock came and went. 9:15. The circuit judge, a stern-faced man named Harlan, looked on with growing impatience. "Where is the petitioner?" Judge Harlan asked, his voice echoing in the silent room. Ilara's lawyer, a sharp, composed woman named Isolde Finch, stood up. "Your Honor, I must confess, I'm not certain. I spoke with my client last night. She was anxious, but resolute. She was supposed to meet me here this morning. She is not answering my telegrams." A murmur went through the room. Julian felt a strange prickle of alarm. Ilara was many things: principled, stubborn, emotional, but she was never irresponsible. She was always meticulously punctual. Cassia leaned in, whispering in his ear. "See? A drama queen. Trying to manipulate the court, make you look bad." Her words were meant to be soothing, but her eyes, fixed on the empty chair beside Miss Finch, held a flicker of something else. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of pure, unadulterated triumph. At 9:30, Judge Harlan banged his gavel. "We will grant a 30-minute recess. Miss Finch, find your client. Mr. Croft, get your affairs in order. This is a court of law, not a theater." As the judge swept out, Julian's gaze was fixed on the empty doorway. Where was she? The alarm was growing, morphing into a genuine, cold fear. This wasn't like Alara. Not at all. The swinging doors of the courthouse opened, and Sheriff Brody stepped inside, his spurs jingling softly on the floorboards. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Julian. "Mr. Croft," the sheriff said, his voice low but carrying across the room. "A word, if you please. We received a telegram from your wife's cousin, a Miss Cora Brandt. She says she can't reach Ilara and that she was due in court this morning." He paused, taking off his hat. "Can you confirm your wife's whereabouts, sir?" The floor seemed to tilt beneath Julian's feet. Ilara wasn't just late. She was missing. The courthouse, once a stage for his anticipated legal victory, had just become the epicenter of his worst nightmare. The courthouse, once a stage for his anticipated legal victory, transformed into the epicenter of Julian's nightmare. The recess stretched from 30 minutes into an indefinite postponement. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary eyes had seen too many tragedies play out under the relentless sun, pulled Julian into the judge's small, airless chambers. Cassia tried to follow, her expression a perfect mask of wifely concern, but the sheriff held up a hand, firm but polite. "Just Mr. Croft for now, ma'am." The door clicked shut, and the world outside, the lawyers, the whispering townsfolk, the smirking mistress, vanished. It was just Julian and the sheriff's probing gaze. "When was the last time you saw your wife, Mr. Croft?" Brody began, his pen poised over a small, worn notebook. "A couple of days ago, at the ranch. She was packing some more of her things," Julian said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. We didn't speak much. Things have been tense." Tense enough for her to run away?" "Run away?" The words felt false as soon as he said them. Number, why would she? The hearing was today. This was what she wanted. Had she really wanted this public evisceration of their marriage, or had he forced her hand until it was the only card she had left to play? "People do strange things under pressure," Brody noted blandly, "especially when there's a child and a railroad fortune involved." "Did you argue?" "We always argued," Julian admitted, rubbing his temples as a headache bloomed behind his eyes. The last time, it had been about the small room adjacent to their own. Ilara had been sanding down a wooden cradle, one his own grandfather had made, preparing it for their child. He had walked in, talking of hiring the finest craftsman from San Francisco to build a new one, to fill the room with expensive toys and furniture, as if he could paper over the cracks in their life with money. She had looked up at him, her hands covered in wood dust, her face weary. "You can't buy your way back into this family, Julian," she had said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "You can't just paint the walls and pretend the foundation isn't rotten." "Oh." The sheriff's questions were relentless. They covered his alibi for the previous night, working late at the land office with Cassia, the state of his marriage, the details of his affair. Every answer seemed to cast him in a darker light. He was the cheating husband, the man with the most to gain from his wife's disappearance. He was the prime suspect. He knew it. When he finally emerged from the room, the world had shifted on its axis. The news had already broken, spreading through town like a brush fire. Railroad baron's pregnant wife vanishes on day of divorce hearing. The headlines were brutal. His face was plastered everywhere, next to a smiling photo of Ilara from the town's Founders' Day picnic a few years ago. She looked happy, vibrant. He looked like the monster who had taken that away. Back at the ranch, the silence he'd noticed that morning now felt menacing. Every empty room seemed to hold an accusation. Cassia, however, seemed to blossom in the chaos. She took charge, fielding telegrams from his business partners in the East, managing the concerned and secretly thrilled neighbors who came to call. She was a fortress of efficiency, his shield against the storm. "It's a stunt, Julian," she insisted that evening, pouring him a glass of whiskey he didn't want. "A publicity stunt. Ilara knows she has a weak case, so she creates a media circus. She makes you look like a villain to pressure you into a bigger settlement. It's brilliant, in a sick way. That lawyer of hers, Isolde Finch, probably cooked up the whole thing. It made sense. It was a logical, strategic explanation. It was a move Julian himself might have made in a business deal, but it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like the Ilara he knew. The woman he'd married loved her privacy and abhorred public scenes. She would never willingly put herself and their unborn child at the center of this kind of spectacle. The next afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode out to the ranch himself, his face grim. They had found Ilara's buckboard wagon. It was abandoned at Sentinel's Point, a treacherous cliff overlook known for its breathtaking views and its grim history. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse was on the passenger seat, her wallet and a few personal effects inside. On the dashboard was a single, folded piece of paper. "It's a note, Mr. Croft," Brody said, his face unreadable. He slid a photograph of it across the polished dining table. The handwriting was Ilara's. The elegant, looping script was unmistakable. "I can't do this anymore. The pressure, the lies. I need to get away. Don't look for me." Julian stared at it. It was her handwriting, but the words were hollow. They felt wrong, impersonal. It was a caricature of a farewell, a cliché, pulled from a sad song. Cassia, who had been allowed to sit in on this meeting, squeezed his hand under the table. "Oh, Julian," she whispered, her voice filled with a convincing pity. "I told you she was unstable. This proves it." To the sheriff, to the town, it was the final piece of the puzzle. Ilara Croft, distraught and unstable, had walked away from her life, possibly into the churning river below. The search shifted from a missing person case to a recovery mission. The narrative was set, but as Julian looked at the photo of the note, something snagged in his mind. A detail, small and insignificant, a memory. Ilara always dotted her eyes with a tiny, almost imperceptible circle, a habit she'd had since she was a girl. The eyes in the note were dotted with simple, sharp jabs. It was nothing, a meaningless detail. He was probably overthinking it, looking for patterns where none existed. But the thought took root, a tiny seed of doubt in the fertile ground of his guilt. The seed of doubt, planted by a simple dot of ink, took root in the barren ground of Julian's grief. In the days that followed, the world accepted the narrative Cassia had so expertly nurtured. Ilara Croft was gone. The river was searched, but the currents were swift and unforgiving. The town offered its condolences, their pity, a heavy cloak that Julian wore in public. At the ranch, Cassia's presence expanded to fill the void Ilara had left. She began making small changes, suggestions offered in a gentle, caring tone. She replaced the simple, hand-stitched curtains in the dining room with heavy velvet drapes from a catalogue back east. She started sitting in on his meetings, her sharp mind offering ruthless solutions to business problems that had once been tempered by Ilara's quiet conscience. The house began to smell of her city perfume, erasing the last lingering traces of sage and lavender. Outwardly, Julian played the part of the grieving, confused husband. He allowed Cassia to comfort him, to manage his life. But inwardly, he was a detective in his own home. He had been a fool, not just for the affair, but for his complete and utter underestimation of his wife. He had mistaken her quietness for passivity, her gentleness for weakness. He had looked at the wild, untamed desert and seen only a wasteland to be conquered, never noticing the resilient, deep-rooted life that thrived within it. He had made the same mistake with Ilara. One night, unable to sleep, he walked through the silent house, a ghost in his own museum. He found himself in his office, a space he'd once shared with Ilara before her things had been moved to a guest room. He sat at his large oak desk, the silence of the ranch pressing in on him. He felt an overwhelming urge to find something, anything that felt real, that felt like the true Ilara. He started opening drawers, sifting through old land deeds and railroad ledgers, a man searching for a memory. His fingers brushed against something small and wooden at the back of his personal drawer, a place Cassia never went. He pulled it out. It was a tiny, crudely carved bird, its wings outstretched, whittled from the dark, fragrant wood of a juniper tree. He hadn't seen it in years. He and Ilara had bought it from an old Tohono O'odham man at a market near the San Xavier mission on their first anniversary. They'd been caught in a sudden desert downpour and had taken shelter in the man's dusty stall, laughing as they huddled together under the canvas awning. Ilara had loved the little bird, saying it looked determined, as if it were flying straight into the wind. He had put it in his desk drawer for safekeeping and, in the arrogance of his success, had promptly forgotten about it. It shouldn't have been there. This desk had been professionally cleaned and organized just last month by his clerk. Every paperclip, every file had been put in its place. Everything was accounted for. And Alara wouldn't have put it back. She hadn't used this desk in months, not since the chill had settled between them. He turned the small bird over in his palm. It was a tangible piece of their shared history, a history he had tried to erase with a newer, shinier affair. Why was it here now? It felt like a message, a deliberate act. It was a piece of the real Alara, not the unstable caricature everyone believed her to be. For the first time since she vanished, a different kind of thought entered Julian's mind, cold and sharp as an icicle. What if Cassia was wrong? What if Sheriff Brody was wrong? What if everyone was wrong and this wasn't a tragic breakdown, but a calculated, brilliant plan? And if Alara had a plan, it meant she wasn't a victim of her emotions. She was a player in the game. He looked around his own office with new eyes. He had allowed Cassia to redecorate it a few months ago, replacing Alara's warm, earthy tones with dark leather and polished brass. It was a room designed for power and intimidation, Cassia's vision of what his space should be. But the juniper bird, small and unassuming, was a defiant speck of life in the sterile landscape, a relic of a different world. Alara had put it there. He was certain of it. It was a breadcrumb, left for him and him alone. He began to rethink everything. The abandoned wagon, the impersonal note, Cassia's immediate and unwavering narrative of Alara's instability. It was all too neat, too clean. It was a story, and Cassia was its most enthusiastic storyteller. And he, Julian Croft, the master strategist who had built an empire, had been playing on the wrong board all along. The discovery of the juniper bird shifted something fundamental inside Julian. The fog of guilt and confusion began to thin, replaced by a crystalline, unnerving clarity. He began to watch Cassia, truly observing her for the first time, not as a lover, but as a strategist studies an opponent. He noticed how her eyes would flick towards the telegraph office whenever a new dispatch arrived, a flicker of hungry anticipation in their stormy depths. He saw how she expertly steered any conversation with concerned townsfolk back to Alara's fragile state, reinforcing the narrative at every turn. She was not merely comforting him, she was managing the perception of the entire town, ensuring the official story hardened into accepted fact. One evening, he feigned a headache from too much whiskey and went to bed early. He listened until he heard the soft click of his bedroom door and Cassia's footsteps receding down the hall. He waited 20 minutes, the silence of the house amplifying the frantic rhythm of his heart. Then, he slipped out of bed and went not to the guest room Alara had been using, but to the one Cassia had claimed as her own. It was immaculate, organized with an almost military precision that spoke of a mind that left nothing to chance. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but the juniper bird had taught him to search for anomalies, for things that felt out of place. He checked her travel case, her closet, the locked hat box where she kept her personal letters. Nothing. Then he saw it, a small, leather-bound satchel tucked away in the bottom of her armoire, the kind a lady might use for toiletries. He unzipped it. Inside, amongst the expensive creams and perfumes from the East, was a small, unlabeled prescription bottle filled with a clear, viscous liquid. It was almost empty. A chill snaked down his spine, colder than any desert night. Alara had suffered terribly from morning sickness during the first few months of her pregnancy. But then, about a month before she left, it had become something else. She was constantly fatigued, dizzy, and at times, strangely confused. She'd complained of a strange metallic taste in her mouth, a bitterness she couldn't wash away. The town doctor, a well-meaning but overworked man, had run what few tests he could and had chalked it up to a difficult pregnancy, prescribing rest and calming tonics. Cassia had been so helpful during that time. Julian remembered it clearly now. She was always brewing Alara special herbal teas she'd ordered from a boutique apothecary in San Francisco, claiming they would help settle her stomach. Cassia, always attentive, always there with a warm cup and a soothing word. Julian's blood ran cold. He took a picture of the bottle with his pocket camera, a newfangled device he'd acquired for surveying land, his hand trembling slightly in the dim lamplight. He put it back exactly where he found it, wiped his prints from the satchel's clasp with his handkerchief, and slipped out of the room. He spent the rest of the night in his office, the juniper bird on the desk in front of him, a tiny totem of truth. He was spiraling. He knew this was a dark, conspiratorial path he was heading down. He was accusing the woman sleeping down the hall of something monstrous, based on a carved bird, a misplaced dot of ink, and an unlabeled bottle. Was he losing his mind? Was he, like Alara was supposed to be, cracking under the pressure? He needed proof. He needed something more than suspicion. The next day, he made an excuse to ride into town alone, telling Cassia he needed to meet with Gideon Sharp to discuss the legal ramifications of having Alara declared officially missing and eventually deceased. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Instead of going to Gideon's office, he rode to a quieter part of town, to a small, unassuming office above the livery stable. The name on the door read Silas Kane, Private Investigations. Kane was a throwback, a man in his late 50s with a rumpled suit, a face like a roadmap of disappointments, and eyes that missed nothing. Julian had found his name through a discreet inquiry made by his former head of security, a man whose loyalty he trusted above all others. Julian laid it all out. The affair, the divorce, the disappearance, Cassia's convenient narrative, the strange note, the juniper bird, and finally, the unlabeled bottle. He felt paranoid, saying it all aloud, like a madman weaving a fantasy. Kane listened without interruption, steepling his fingers, his expression unreadable. When Julian finished, Kane was silent for a long moment, the only sound, the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. "You rich men," he finally said, his voice gravelly. "You swim with sharks, then you're surprised when you get bit." He leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "The mistress is always the prime suspect in a case like this, right after the husband. The fact that the sheriff isn't looking at her means she's played her cards very, very well." "So, you think I'm right?" Julian asked, a desperate edge to his voice. "I think your wife is either at the bottom of the Sovereign River or she's a hell of a lot smarter than you ever gave her credit for," Kane stated bluntly. "And from what you've told me, my money's on smart. This disappearance is too perfect. It's designed to look like a breakdown, which is exactly what a smart person would do if they wanted to vanish and frame someone else for it later." "Frame who? Me? Or the girlfriend?" Kane said. "Let's find out. I'll start with her, Cassia Thorne. I'll dig into her finances, her telegram records, her past. See if she's got a history of this. And this apothecary in San Francisco, I'll pay them a visit. In the meantime, you play the part. You're the grieving husband. You lean on her. Make her think she has you completely under her thumb. The more comfortable she gets, the more likely she is to slip up." Leaving Kane's office, Julian felt a strange sense of relief. He wasn't crazy. He had an ally, someone who saw the same dark shapes in the shadows that he did. The game had changed. He was no longer a passive suspect. He was an active player working in the dark. For the next week, Julian Croft played the role of his life. He was listless, despondent, a man adrift in a sea of grief. He let Cassia make decisions for him, Let her screen his telegrams. Let her speak for him to concerned business partners. He watched as she grew more confident, more proprietary with every passing day. She started talking about redecorating the master suite, about a trip to San Francisco once this whole mess is behind us. She was planning their future, a future built upon the foundation of Alara's absence. And all the while, Julian was waiting for Silas Kane to call, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He saw her true nature in small, unguarded moments. He saw the cold flash of irritation in her eyes when a ranch hand mentioned Alara's name with fondness. He saw the calculating way she assessed the value of the silver on the dining table, her fingers tracing the patterns not with appreciation, but with the touch of an appraiser. He was living with a stranger, a beautiful, venomous serpent he had willingly invited into his home. The guilt of his betrayal was a physical weight, but it was now overshadowed by a cold, rising rage. The summons came as a discreet note delivered by a stable boy, tucked inside a copy of the Sovereignty Sentinel. Feed delivery schedule needs clarification. Noon. Julian knew the code. He found Kane in a smoky corner of the town's less reputable saloon, a place Julian Croft would never normally set foot. The investigator didn't waste time on pleasantries. He pushed a glass of cheap whiskey toward Julian and got straight to the point. "Your girlfriend, Cassia Thorne," Kane began, his voice a low rumble that cut through the noise of the bar. "She's got secrets, big ones." He laid out what his inquiries and telegrams to contacts back east had uncovered. A few years ago, she was the personal assistant to a wealthy, much older shipping magnate in New York, a man named Alistair Finch. He died suddenly. Heart attack, the doctors said. Left her a surprisingly large sum in his will, calling her his devoted protégée. Finch's family contested it, claimed undue influence, but they lost. The talk was that the old man's health took a sharp turn for the worse right after she came into his life. Sound familiar? A cold dread washed over Julian. It wasn't a one-time act of passion or desperation. It was a pattern, a profession. "Keep digging," Julian said, his voice tight. "Oh, I am," Kane grunted. "And that apothecary in San Francisco. It's a front. The owner is a charlatan who lost his license a decade ago for peddling bogus cures and poisons to the city's underbelly. I'm having a sample of that tea she gave your wife analyzed by a proper chemist. But that's not the worst of it." Kane leaned closer, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "I got a hit on her financials. A week before your wife disappeared, Cassia transferred $200,000 to an offshore account." He paused, letting the weight of the amount sink in. "An account opened in the name of, you ready for this? Cora Brunt. Alara's cousin," Julian said, his mind reeling. "The one who reported her missing." "The very same," Kane confirmed, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "Your girlfriend wasn't just trying to get rid of your wife. She was building a cage for the cousin. If anything went wrong, if the cousin ever got a conscience and started talking, that money trail would make it look like she was paid to help Alara vanish. A nice little insurance policy. Cassia's playing chess. Mr. Croft, not checkers." Julian sat back, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity, revealing a picture more sinister than he could have ever imagined. Cassia hadn't just stumbled into his life. She had targeted him. She was a predator, and he had been her willing, blinded prey. And she had made one fatal miscalculation. She had seen Alara as an obstacle, a weak piece to be swept from the board, not as an opposing queen. He paid Kane, his hand steady despite the tremor in his soul. He walked out of the saloon and into the harsh, bright sunlight, his knuckles white on the reins of his horse. The world looked the same, the dusty street, the false-fronted buildings, the vast, in different blue sky, but for Julian, everything had changed. He was no longer just a guilty man, he was a weapon, waiting to be aimed. 2 weeks to the day after Ilara's disappearance, it arrived. Julian had just finished a tense conference call via telegraph with the board of his company, a stilted, frustrating affair where he'd had to reassure them that his personal turmoil would not affect the railroad's relentless expansion. It was a lie. His personal turmoil was the only thing on his mind. He was walking through the grand, echoing foyer of the ranch house when his housekeeper, Maria, handed him the mail. Bills, junk mail, a few cattlemen's journals. And then he saw it. A thick, cream-colored envelope made of expensive linen paper, the kind of stationery used for important legal correspondence. There was no return address, just his name, Julian Croft, and the ranch's address written in precise, typed lettering. It had been sent via courier from Monterey, not the regular post. His name was underlined, and below it, the words, "Strictly personal and confidential." He took the envelope into his office and closed the door, a sudden jolt of adrenaline cutting through his feigned lethargy. Cassia was out, riding the property line with the foreman, a task she'd taken upon herself with unsettling authority. He was alone. He slid the envelope open with a silver letter opener, his hands surprisingly steady. Inside were 2 items. The first was a formal letter on the letterhead of a law firm he didn't recognize. Finch, Davies, and Associates. Isolde Finch, Ilara's lawyer. He scanned the letter, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Mr. Croft, this letter is sent to you upon the specific instructions of my client, Ilara Vance, to be delivered 14 days after her departure. Enclosed, you will find a key. It belongs to a safe deposit box at a specific branch of the Pacific Mercantile Bank in Monterey. My client has left instructions for you, and only you, to be granted access to this box. She also asked me to include a personal message. She said you would understand its meaning." Julian's eyes darted to the bottom of the page. Below the lawyer's signature was a single, typed sentence. "Remember the promise we made under the Monterey cypress. Your future is waiting there." He dropped the letter onto his desk as if it were hot. The Monterey cypress. It was a specific, ancient tree on the 17-mile drive, a place they'd gone on one of their first magical weekend trips together, long before the railroad had consumed him. They had sat under its gnarled branches, looking out at the endless, churning Pacific, and had made promises to each other, silly, romantic promises about trust, honesty, and always finding their way back to each other, no matter what. It was a memory so intensely personal, so far removed from the bitterness of the past year, that it felt like a message from a different lifetime, from a different woman. The second item in the envelope fell onto the desk with a soft clink, a small, cold brass key. It was attached to a simple plastic tag with a number etched into it, 417. This was it. This was the next breadcrumb. It wasn't just a clue, it was a test. Ilara was testing him. Could he remember the man he used to be? Could he decipher a message rooted in love, not in anger? Cassia would never have known about the cypress tree. His lawyer, Gideon, wouldn't have known. This was from Ilara, a direct line from her hiding place to his heart. He felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation. Ilara was alive, she was safe, and she was fighting back. He had to move quickly. Cassia would be back soon. He pocketed the key and crumpled the letter, stuffing it deep into his trousers. He had to get to that bank. He grabbed his coat, shouting to Maria that he was heading to the land office for an urgent matter. As he rode his fastest horse out of the driveway, a rider approached at a gallop. It was the stable boy, with another note, this one from Silas Kane. Julian tore it open, his horse dancing with impatience beneath him. Chemist report is back on the tea, not just herbs. Contained traces of a plant extract. Wolfsbane. Administered in small, steady doses, it doesn't kill. It mimics symptoms of severe anxiety, confusion, heart palpitations. It makes a person look like they're losing their mind. It's an old poisoner's trick. C's playing for keeps. Julian crushed the note in his fist, his knuckles white. The pieces were clicking into place, revealing a picture more demonic than he could have imagined. Cassia hadn't just been making Ilara sick. She had been medically gaslighting her, systematically destroying her credibility to create the very portrait of the unstable woman she now described to the world. He spurred his horse, the animal leaping forward. He rode faster, the dusty landscape blurring into streaks of brown and gold. The Pacific Mercantile Bank was a stately, old-world building in downtown Monterey, the kind of place that prided itself on discretion. He walked in, the small brass key feeling heavy and momentous in his pocket. His future, the note had said. He was about to find out if it was a future of redemption or one of ruin. The air in the bank vault was cold and still, smelling of old paper and cold steel. The bank manager, a prim man named Mr. Abernathy, recognized Julian immediately, his expression a mixture of professional courtesy and morbid curiosity. Julian presented the key and a letter of authorization from Isolde Finch's law firm, which she had clearly filed in advance. After a series of procedural checks that felt agonizingly slow, Abernathy personally escorted him down into the vault. He used his own key on one of the locks, then stepped aside. "Box 417, Mr. Croft," he said quietly, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. "Please let me know when you are finished." Unquote. Julian stood alone in the small, private viewing room, the heavy vault door clicking shut behind him. He slid his key into the second lock. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. He pulled out the long, heavy metal box and set it on the polished, wooden table. He took a deep breath, like a diver, about to plunge into unknown depths. He lifted the lid. It wasn't filled with jewels or cash, it was filled with evidence, meticulously organized, dated, and labeled. It was Ilara's counteroffensive. It was a declaration of war. On top lay a sealed envelope addressed to him in her familiar, elegant script, Julian. He opened it with trembling fingers. "My dearest Julian, if you are reading this, it means you chose to remember. It means there is still a part of the man I married inside the stranger you became. I hope so. For our baby's sake, I pray so. I am safe. Do not try to find me. The people helping me will know if I am compromised, and this evidence will go straight to the sheriff, with you painted as Cassia's accomplice. Right now, you are my only hope of exposing her without destroying our child's future in a public war. I knew you wouldn't believe me if I just told you. You were blind to her. I had to show you. I had to disappear to make you see. Everything you need to know is in this box. Look at it all. Understand what she island. Then you must be the man I know you can be. Be smart. Be patient. Set the trap. For me. For our son. Yours always. Ilara. Our son. The words hit him like a physical blow. A son. He sank into the chair, the letter clutched in his hand, a wave of shame and regret so powerful it almost choked him. He had been worried about his fortune, his reputation, while Ilara had been fighting for her life, for their son's life. He turned to the contents of the box. It was an arsenal. First, there were the financial records. Ilara, who had always taken an interest in their family's finances despite his dismissiveness, had clearly been tracking things for months. There were printouts of offshore bank accounts under names he didn't recognize, but Silas Kane's intel gave them context. There were copies of wire transfers from his personal accounts, small amounts disguised as consulting fees or art purchases, signed off on documents Cassia had given him to approve documents he'd barely glanced at. She had been siphoning his money for nearly a year, bleeding him slowly. The total was staggering, well over $200,000. Next was a small USB drive, a modern marvel he barely understood. He plugged it into a tablet the viewing room provided. It contained audio files. He clicked on the first one, dated 3 months ago. It was Cassia's voice, low and conspiratorial, recorded through a door or a thin wall. She was on the phone. No, he suspects nothing. He's so arrogant. He thinks she's just being a difficult pregnant woman. The doctor is useless, keeps telling her it's just hormones. The drops are working, but slowly. It makes her confused, weak. By the time we get to court, she'll look like a hysterical mess. His lawyers will tear her apart. Yes, of course I'm being careful. Just make sure the account is ready. Once he's mine, everything is ours. Julian felt sick. The special tea, the wolfsbane. It wasn't just to make her ill. It was to systematically discredit her, to medically gaslight her into appearing mentally incompetent. He listened to another file. This one was more recent, just 2 weeks before Alara disappeared. The cousin, Cora, is on board. She thinks she's helping Alara escape an abusive husband. She has no idea she's the fallback plan. If anything goes wrong, the money I sent her will make it look like she was paid to help Alara vanish. It's perfect. Either way, Ilara's out of the picture and I'm in. So, Ilara had known. She had known her own cousin was being manipulated. She had let it happen, playing the long game. The most damning evidence was at the bottom of the box. It was a medical file from a different doctor, a Dr. Lawrence Childs, a toxicologist in a neighboring city. Inside was a lab report analyzing a sample of Ilara's blood. Taken 6 weeks ago, it showed trace amounts of aconitum, the scientific name for wolfsbane, a potent cardiotoxin that, when administered in small, regular doses, could mimic the symptoms of severe anxiety, depression, and cognitive impairment. Attached was a signed statement from Ilara detailing how Cassia had insisted on making her tea every day, how her health had declined, and how she'd grown suspicious. She had saved a sample of the tea leaves and had them analyzed by the same lab. The results matched. It was a cold-blooded, premeditated plot to not only destroy her credibility, but to potentially harm her and their child. He finally understood the full scope of Ilara's plan. The disappearance, the misleading note in her own handwriting which she likely wrote as part of her plan, leaving her personal effects behind. It was all designed to create a perfect narrative that Cassia would eagerly promote. Ilara had laid a trap, and Cassia had walked right into it, feeling smug and victorious. Now the trap was ready to be sprung, and Ilara had handed him the trigger. He packed everything back into the box, his mind racing. Ilara's instructions were clear: be smart, be patient, set the trap. He couldn't just march into the sheriff's office. Cassia was clever. She would deny everything, paint him as a desperate man trying to shift blame. The evidence was powerful, but a good lawyer could muddy the waters, especially with the money Cassia had stolen. He needed a confession. He needed to catch her red-handed. He left the bank a changed man. The arrogant, self-assured millionaire was gone, stripped away by the horrifying truth. In his place was a man with a singular, chilling purpose: to execute his wife's plan and get his family back. When Julian arrived back at the estate, the sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows across the land. He found Cassia in the main living room, sipping a glass of champagne, a small, celebratory act he now found repulsive. She smiled as he walked in, a picture of domestic bliss. "There you are," she said, her voice silky. "I was starting to worry. How was the meeting with Gideon?" "It was fine," he said, his voice carefully neutral. He walked over to the decanter and poured himself a stiff drink, his back to her so she couldn't see the tremor of rage in his hands. "The usual legal nonsense. They're preparing to have Ilara declared legally dead if she's not found in the next 6 months. He let that hang in the air, watching her reflection in the window glass. A flicker of pure, unadulterated pleasure crossed her face before being replaced by a mask of sympathy. "Oh, Julian, that's awful," she murmured, rising from her chair to stand beside him. "But maybe it's for the best, for closure." "Maybe," he said, taking a long swallow of his drink. He looked at her then, at this beautiful, venomous woman who had so thoroughly duped him. The rage was a living thing inside him, a wild horse kicking at the walls of a corral, but he buried it deep. Ilara's words echoed in his head. "Be smart, be patient." He walked over to the sofa and sat down, patting the cushion next to him. "Sit with me, Cassia." She looked surprised, but pleased, and settled beside him. He took her hand, a gesture that made his skin crawl. "You know," he began, his voice low and intimate, "you've been my rock through all of this. I don't know what I would have done without you. All this chaos, it's made me realize what's important." Her eyes widened, shining with anticipation in the lamplight. "What's that, Julian?" He looked directly into her eyes, summoning every ounce of his acting ability, every ruthless instinct he'd ever used in a boardroom negotiation. "You," he said simply, "once this is all settled, once Ilara is legally gone, I think we should get married." The mask of sympathy dissolved completely, replaced by a radiant, triumphant smile. It was the smile of a predator that has finally cornered its prey, never suspecting that the prey is leading it into a cage. "Oh, Julian," she breathed, throwing her arms around his neck. "I thought you'd never ask." He held her close, the scent of her perfume making him sick, and stared over her shoulder into the dark, empty room. The trap was set. Now he just had to wait for her to spring it. His proposal acted as the final sedative for Cassia's caution. She became bold, almost reckless in her victory. The future she had so meticulously plotted for was no longer a distant dream. It was tangible, within her grasp. And Julian, playing the role of the devoted, liberated fiancé, gave her all the rope she needed to hang herself. He immediately contacted Silas Kane and Isolde Finch. They met secretly in a drab, anonymous hotel room in a neighboring town, a world away from Julian's gilded life. He laid out the contents of the safe deposit box. Isolde, who had clearly been aware of the broad strokes of Ilara's plan, looked grimly satisfied. Silas whistled low. "Your wife is one for the books, Croft," the PI said, shaking his head in admiration. "She built the perfect case. All we need to do is get the pretty girlfriend to admit to it on tape." The plan they concocted was simple and elegant in its cruelty. It would use Cassia's own greed and arrogance against her. "She thinks she's won the grand prize. You and your fortune," Isolde said, her voice sharp and precise. "We need to create a situation where she feels so secure, so untouchable, that she'll boast about her cleverness. The wedding is the perfect pretext." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Julian threw himself into the charade with the same ruthless focus he usually reserved for a corporate takeover. He insisted on a prenuptial agreement, but a ridiculously generous one, framed as a way to protect Cassia and show the world this was a real marriage, not a financial transaction. The prenup, drafted by Isolde and designed to be legally porous, essentially promised Cassia a vast portion of his liquid assets, but with one critical hidden clause. It would be rendered null and void by any evidence of criminal activity or fraud perpetrated against Julian or his immediate family. Cassia, presented with a document that promised her hundreds of millions of dollars, barely skimmed the fine print. Her own lawyer, a flashy but incompetent man she'd chosen for his malleability, pronounced it a major victory. Next, Julian planned an extravagant engagement party. It was to be held at the ranch, a lavish affair to officially announce their union to the world. A new beginning, he told her, and she'd kissed him, thrilled. The party would be the stage for their final act. Silas Kane's team would wire the entire ground floor of the mansion with high-fidelity microphones and hidden cameras focusing on the library, a cozy, intimate space where Julian planned to have his final conversation with her. The night of the party arrived. The ranch house was ablaze with light, lanterns strung between the ancient oak trees. Hundreds of guests from the highest echelons of society mingled on the lawns, sipping champagne and gossiping about the whirlwind romance. Cassia was radiant, draped in diamonds and a couture gown, accepting congratulations with the grace of a queen ascending her throne. Julian played his part, smiling, shaking hands, his arm possessively around his fiancée. But beneath the surface, his nerves were stretched taut. Sheriff Brody, clued in by Isolde with a carefully edited version of events, was on standby with a small, plain-clothed team just a mile down the road, waiting for a single, pre-arranged signal. Late in the evening, as the party was in full swing and the orchestra played a waltz on the veranda, Julian led Cassia away from the crowd. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and expensive cigars. He leaned in close, his voice a conspiratorial whisper against her ear. "Come with me," he said. "I have a special gift for you, something just for us." He led her through the throng of guests, past smiling faces and raised glasses, to the library. He closed the heavy oak doors behind them, shutting out the noise of the party. The room was suddenly quiet, intimate. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. On a small table sat 2 glasses and a bottle of vintage champagne, just as planned. The trap was ready. "A gift?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of delight and avarice. "Julian, the party, the ring, it's all too much." "Nothing is too much for you," he said, his voice smooth as silk as he expertly uncorked the champagne. The soft pop echoed in the silent room. He handed her a glass. "You deserve everything, especially after all you had to deal with Ilara." He saw her guard drop completely. This was what she'd been waiting for, his full, unadulterated acknowledgement of her role in his liberation. "She was a problem," Cassia said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, taking a delicate sip of champagne. "But we don't have to talk about her tonight." No, I want to," Julian insisted, his voice a perfect blend of admiration and intimacy. He sat beside her on the leather sofa, the hidden microphone just inches away. "I never properly thanked you. You were so smart, Cassia, so brilliant. The way you handled it all, the way you made everyone believe she was just unstable." A self-satisfied smile graced her lips. "Well, she wasn't the strongest person, sentimental, predictable. She was easy to manipulate. All I had to do was give her a little push." "A little push?" he prompted, keeping his voice soft. "It was more than that. It was genius. The tea, the drops, making her think she was losing her own mind. Where did you even come up with that?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of suspicion in their depths. "How do you know about that?" He laughed, a smooth, confident sound he'd perfected in boardrooms. "Cassia, please. Do you think I'm an idiot? I knew she was becoming a liability. I saw what you were doing. I just let it happen. You were doing what I didn't have the courage to do myself." This was the critical lie, the one designed to disarm her completely. He was making himself her accomplice. The suspicion in her eyes vanished, replaced by a shared, conspiratorial glee. She let out a small, triumphant laugh, a sound both beautiful and chilling. "Oh, Julian, I should have known you were smarter than you let on. I was worried there for a minute. I really thought you'd bought the whole sad, broken Ilara act." "I bought the parts the world needed to see," he said, leaning closer, his gaze intense. "But I knew my brilliant Cassia was pulling the strings, even the note in the wagon. Perfect. And framing the cousin, so clever. A loose end tied up before it even unraveled." She was practically glowing with pride. She had not only won, but she was finally getting the credit she felt she deserved from the one person whose opinion mattered. "She was never right for you, Julian," Cassia said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She was a weight holding you down. Timid, boring. She couldn't keep up with you. I can. Together, we can own the world." She leaned in to kiss him, her lips tasting of champagne and victory. Julian pulled back slightly. "Just one more thing, for my peace of mind. Now that we're going to be married, there are no more secrets, right? Ilara, she's gone for good? There's no chance she could suddenly reappear and ruin this?" Cassia's smile turned cold, reptilian. It was the first time he had seen the true, naked predator beneath the beautiful facade. "Don't worry about Ilara," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper that the microphone captured perfectly. "Even if she did crawl out from whatever rock she's hiding under, who would believe her? A woman with a history of mental breakdowns whose own cousin was paid to help her run away? Her life is over. I made sure of it." It was the final nail in her coffin. The confession, clear and undeniable. Julian's demeanor changed instantly. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by an arctic cold. He stood up slowly. "Thank you, Cassia," he said, his voice flat. "That's all I needed to hear." "Olbu," her smile faltered. She looked at him, confused. "Julian, what's wrong?" He pulled a small, silver signal device from his pocket, a simple panic button Silas had provided, and pressed it. "You didn't make sure of anything," he said, his voice filled with a quiet rage she had never heard before. "You just walked into a gilded cage." As if on cue, the library doors swung open. But it wasn't a butler or a guest. It was Sheriff Brody, flanked by two uniformed deputies. Silas, Kane, and Isolde Finch stood behind them in the doorway, their faces grim. Cassia's face went white, her eyes darting from Julian to the police, her mind, finally, belatedly, processing the betrayal. The champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the polished floor. "Julian Croft," she stammered, her voice a strangled squeak. "What is this? What's going on?" "It's over, Cassia," Julian said, his voice ringing with the authority she had once found so attractive. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and a list of other charges my wife's lawyer will be happy to detail for you." "Your wife?" she whispered, the word tasting like poison, and as the deputies stepped forward, cuffs in hand, Cassia Thorne finally understood. She had never been the predator, she was just the prey that had been caught. Cassia's arrest at her own engagement party ignited a firestorm that swept through the territory. The tape-recorded confession was ironclad, and her carefully constructed world imploded in a single, spectacular night. Facing overwhelming evidence and charges ranging from attempted murder to grand larceny, she was denied bail. The news even prompted authorities in New York to reopen the case of a wealthy shipping magnate who had died suddenly in her care years earlier. Her predatory past had finally caught up with her. With Cassia neutralized, Isolde Finch gave Julian an address in Boston. He took the first train east, his mind a maelstrom of regret and fragile hope. The rhythmic clatter of the steel wheels on the track, the very sound of his ambition, now felt like a countdown to the most important negotiation of his life. He found Elara in a quiet, respectable boarding house, her hand resting on her prominently pregnant belly. She stood not as a victim, but as a victor, her eyes clear and strong, though shadowed with a weariness that cut him to the core. The space between them was charged with unspoken history, with betrayal and a love he had almost destroyed. "Elara," he began, his voice cracking, "I am so sorry." He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to justify his weakness or his blindness. He confessed it all: his arrogance, his carelessness, and the profound moral failure that had allowed Cassia's poison to seep into their lives. He apologized for failing to protect her and their unborn son, the words feeling utterly inadequate for the depth of his transgression. Her response wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was a blunt, necessary truth. "Yes, Julian," she said calmly, her voice steady, "you were all of those things." The simple honesty of it pierced him deeper than any accusation. "I know," he whispered, taking a hesitant step closer. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise to spend the rest of my life earning back your trust. I want to be the man who made you that promise under the cypress tree." A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a path down her cheek. She reached out and took his hand, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him. "I had to believe that man was still in there," she said softly. "It's what kept me going." Their path forward was not an easy, fairy tale reunion. It was a fragile, deliberate reconstruction. They sold the Grand Ranch house, a gilded cage of painful memories, and found a new home by the sea in Monterey, a place of quiet beginnings. It was a life rebuilt piece by painstaking piece, cemented with counseling and a brutal honesty they'd never shared before. Julian learned to listen, truly listen, not as a businessman waiting for his turn to speak, but as a husband and a partner. He learned that strength was not just in conquering land, but in yielding to the truth. 3 months later, Elara gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named Daniel. As Julian held his son for the first time, swaddled in a simple cotton blanket, he felt the immense, terrifying weight of his second chance. This tiny, perfect child, with a tuft of dark hair and Elara's clear, honest eyes, was the living embodiment of the future Elara had fought for with such fierce, quiet intelligence. He looked from his son's face to his wife's, her features soft with exhaustion but lit with a love that humbled him. Their new family, scarred but whole, was not built on an empire of steel or a fortune of gold. It was built on something far stronger, something unshakable, the hard-won, unbreakable truth. And in the quiet peace of that room, with the sound of the Pacific waves whispering outside, Julian Croft finally understood the difference between owning the world and having one.